Enter Mrs. Grundy. She is a small, well-preserved woman with ringlets and rosy cheeks, rather tightly laced, wears a gaily colored poke bonnet with a wreath of roses under the brim, crinoline, lace shawl, white stockings with black slippers, lace mitts, and with fan dangling from her waist. Her manner is mincing, honeyed, patronizing, very determined and dictatorial, occasionally spiteful. She is quite aware of her own importance.
I am here to register a protest against the modern point of view. It is an outrageous assault on womanhood. Let those of us who belong to the privileged classes be content with our privileges and not join in this vulgar clamor for rights. We must never forget that man is man and woman is woman. Let us leave woman where heaven has placed her, on a pedestal. Don't let us drag her down into the mire. I am scandalized at the indecorum of the present day, especially the bold young girls of the present day who demand a college education just as if they were men. And some of them actually want to earn their living in horrid masculine ways. Typewriters or doctors or lawyers or farmers or gardeners. Why, in my time, if a girl did not marry, she was quite content to stay at home and do a little sewing in a state of genteel starvation. That was the proper thing for a well-bred woman.
Is this Mrs. Grundy? Ladies and gentlemen, this is the celebrated Mrs. Grundy, the arbiter of fashion, the mold of form, the guardian of propriety. Mrs. Grundy, are you a suffragist?
I, a suffragist? Oh, no, indeed. How could I be anything so promiscuous? Why, if I could vote, my cook could vote, and I might meet my cook at the polls. How vulgar. Suffragist, no! No.
Then may I ask, what are you doing here?
I have come here to protest against the brazen woman who makes herself conspicuous on a public platform. May I have the doubtful pleasure of saying a few words of rebuke to the unmanly men and unwomanly women I see before me?
Oh, certainly. Our platform is always open to anti-suffragists, for we believe in free speech.
Do you ladies really think you need the vote? Look at me. I have never had the vote, and yet I ask you, doesn't Mrs. Grundy rule the world? I am sure there are a great many persons who would like to come out openly for women's suffrage, but they don't dare. Why? They are afraid of me. I am proud to think that my influence is keeping millions of women in their proper sphere.
Enter Mrs. Partington, with a large broom. She is tall, gaunt, respectable, middle-aged, muscular, belligerent, with a gruff voice and determined manner. Costume that of a scrub woman.
The woman movement must be stopped. I'm here to stop it. And women's suffrage must be dropped. I tell you, drop it. Though like the sea you fume and fret, with my good broom I'll stem you yet. Fie on your brazen faces, you suffragettes may fume and frown, but if you rise, I'll put you down and keep you in your places.
Dear Mrs. Partington, I am glad to meet such a womanly woman. In this violent age of unsexed females, it is a pleasure to see a gentle creature like yourself who believes in quiet, ladylike methods.
Ladies, really, the rummage sale must go on. If you insist on remaining, I shall have to auction you off as curios. We have for sale 2 very valuable pieces of antique furniture, slightly shop-worn and somewhat moth-eaten, to be sold today at greatly reduced prices.
I protest!
Dame, stop! I protest! I protest!
What is that? Did anyone speak?
Enter Mad Hatter. Costume as described in Alice in Wonderland.
Yes, I spoke, and I intend to go on speaking. It is my business to speak, and women should listen respectfully. Woman's place is in the home. She should stay there and attend to her children. Her domestic duties should occupy her entire attention. No matter what calamities befall the nation, like Mother Charlotte, she should go on cutting bread and butter.
Is that a slice of bread and butter I see in your hand?
Oh, well, yes, and it's the best butter.
Ladies and gentlemen, permit me to introduce that celebrated character, the Mad Hatter.
I have come here this afternoon to represent the Silent Woman.
The Silent Woman? I don't know the lady.
Oh, of course you don't know her. None of your friends are silent. Suffragettes talk all the time. I represent women like Mrs. Grundy and Mrs. Partington, the quiet, stay-at-home kind, never appear in public.
Oh, they seem to be here, and this is a public meeting.
Oh, well, there is nothing so horrid, so disheartening to a manly man like me as the sight of a female on a public platform. Shocking. Real women are domestic, demure, and reticent. As for speaking in public, Mrs. Grundy and Mrs. Partington would rather die than do such a brazen deed.
Mrs. Grundy and Mrs. Partington are both present, and both ladies have put aside their reticence and favored us with a speech.
Oh, yes. They had to do it. Their sense of duty compelled them to speak. The antis are obliged to talk all the time in order to keep other women quiet.
The anti-suffragists are like Thomas Carlyle. We preach the virtues of silence in 40 volumes.
We do not wish to appear in public. I speak for all good housekeepers when I say we would rather remain in the home.
The anti-suffragist never leaves her home. She never goes to the theater or to the opera or concerts or lectures or bridge whist parties. No, never. Nor luncheons, nor dinners, nor suppers, nor teas, nor bargain counters, nor white goods sales. She remains in the home, hermetically sealed there like a fly in amber.
A woman's place is in the home.
Forever in the
Forever
home.
Forever in the home.
Then all the hundreds and thousands of women whom we meet in the theaters, the opera, the department stores, the railroad stations, the streets and the churches, are they all suffragists?
Oh, every one of them.
Oh, how the cause is growing. Don't you think that all nations will soon grant their women the franchise?
Oh, if women's suffrage were adopted, it would bring about the downfall of civilization. It would take us straight back to the caves of our primeval ancestors.
I would have you know, my ancestors were too aristocratic to live in caves. The very first one of them was born in a palace. That's why I don't want the ballot. Women of wealth and social position can get along very comfortably without it. I don't want it myself, and I don't intend other women to have it.
No good housekeeper wants it. I would rather scrub floors forever than undertake the heavy and burdensome task of voting once a year.
Mrs. Partington, you are the greatest living authority on house cleaning, and I would like to inquire, do you approve of this nasty newfangled vacuum cleaner?
No, madam. Like nature, I abhor a vacuum. With my broom, I scour the seas and sweep away modern inventions.
The restless women who want to gad abroad claim that a vacuum cleaner would help save them time and trouble.
Oh, a mere pretext to escape their home duties. Oh, what's their time worth? I agree with the farmer who was asked to buy an incubator because it would save the hens so much trouble. Said the farmer, what's a hen time worth anyhow? That's what I say about the women. Let them go on toiling and moiling, scrubbing and sweeping in the good old-fashioned way.
as their great-grandmothers did before them.
We want no change.
Need no vote.
We have all the rights we want.
With the immortal poet Alexander Pope, we say, whatever is right. Conservatism, that is the keynote of the anti-suffrage movement.
But it is not a movement. It is a concerted and organized effort to stop movements, to sweep back movements.
Our mission is to make these restless modern women cultivate repose of manner and true decorum, to teach them how to say prunes and prisms, how to sit and how to rise gracefully, how to receive a gentleman visitor, how to tread a minuet, how to manage a fan betwitchingly, and how to attract men. That is more important than to vote. And of course, no woman can do both. But
We
old-fashioned women know how to repel a forward suitor whose attentions are too pressing.
One of the silent women wishes to speak.
Man is always woman's superior. No matter what position he occupies, women should look up to man and treat him respectfully. Women cannot vote because they cannot fight.
Cannot fight, but what about Molly Pitcher in the Revolutionary War, who manned her husband's gun?
Women cannot fight.
Of course, ladies, I am an anti-suffragist in my capacity of the a Mad Hatter. I couldn't be anything else, but I must take exception to the physical force argument. Think of the Maid of Saragossa. Think of Joan of Arc. Think of Boudicca and the Amazons. Just think.
I won't think, and you can't make me think. If I thought, I wouldn't be an anti-suffragist. But I know that woman's place is not on the battlefield.
What about Clara Barton and Florence Nightingale?
Women cannot fight. We are too weak, I tell you. Women's strength is in her weakness. We are miserable, timid things. We are not strong enough to force our way to the polls. We can't defend our vote. Ballots and bullets go together. I am a poor, weak woman, and I need protection. How dare you say that women can fight? It is a libel on the sex. Women cannot vote because they cannot fight. I am now using the physical force argument.
Yes, madam, I feel the force of their arguments. I assure you that they make a deep impression on me. With this domestic implement, you have conquered me. Broom, symbol of domesticity. How well you grace a woman's frail and trembling hand. How much better you look clutched in the female paw than that monstrosity, the ballot. Ladies, promise me that your lily-white fingers will never be contaminated by sordid contact with politics.
I swear.
If the housewives of this city, instead of clamoring for that vain bauble, the ballot, would only grasp the broom and go out into the streets and sweep like our friend Mrs. Partington, how soon the streets would be nice and clean in spite of politics and politicians.
Suffragists think the vote in the hands of women would be a broom with which we could make a clean sweep, not only of the streets, but of all unclean things. Therefore, the last thing I have to offer you today is the most precious of all, the ballot. Look on it with hope, for heaven willing, it will soon be yours. Look on it with reverence, for it is the symbol of power. When it comes to you, may you use it well. But before it will come to you, you must be willing to bid for it, and bid high. Not only money must you bid, but courage and devotion and self-sacrifice. You must be ready to contribute your youth, your charm, your ability, your name, your personality, and your heart. And I will ask those who are ready to lay this great price on the altar of their country to give their last assent by a rising vote.
Thank you, everyone. That was absolutely amazing. So now we'd like to just have a conversation about this piece and how plays were used in promoting the women's suffrage movement. But before we do that, I'm just going to have everyone introduce themselves, or just you know what? I'll say the names, and you guys can just give a wave. That works. Okay. So we'll start with our cast. Mrs. Grundy was played by Rachel Schulte. There we go. Wave. Perfect. Mrs. Partington was Julie Thaxter Gourlay. Did I say that right? Is it Gourlay?
You did. Please vote.
Yes. Yes. Our auctioneer was Peter Ackerman.
Please vote.
And the Mad Hatter, Sean Coffey.
Yes, indeed. And please, please, please do vote.
We're sensing a theme. There's a theme. My name is Jeff Rocco, and together with my friend Dakota, who is right next to me in the boxes here, we run Chill Bucket. And then our lovely dramaturg and amazing history lesson giver is Kelly Rogers Flynt. And
yes,
Kelly, another vote. There you go. Kelly, I'm just going to turn it over to you to sort of give us some background on this piece and how theater was used in the movement itself.
Great. That sounds wonderful. And that's a great place to start, is just a little brief overview about the women's suffrage movement. I think it has gotten condensed so much in our textbooks and in schools, and therefore in our mind, collective mind as a nation, that we forget that it was a long struggle, one that had to pass off leadership multiple times before it succeeded. So just a real quick overview. So the first time that women came together and had a written call for suffrage and equality happened in 1848. That was the first Seneca Falls Convention in New York, led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So this was even prior to the Civil War, a long time ago. They went on having these conventions almost every year throughout the 1850s. They missed one year for some reason, but they kept meeting and talking about this call for women's equality and suffrage. And at this time, the suffrage was just one of the many things they were asking for. But it quickly became something that they could coalesce around and say, maybe we can solve some of these other problems if we actually got the suffrage. So they kind of concentrated efforts there. So the first time that a women's suffrage amendment was introduced to Congress was in 1868, but absolutely nothing happened other than it being introduced. Susan B. Anthony, one of our main suffragists, 1872, she cast a vote in a New York election. She was arrested, tried, and found guilty. That was the crime that recently Trump pardoned her for, but then her estate rejected the pardon because they wanted it on record. Anyway, that's a whole side story. Then in 1874, the Supreme Court ruled that citizenship does not give you the automatic right to vote, that those political rights are subject to state laws. So the Supreme Court just kind of kicked it down the field there and did not really do anything to move things forward. Then we had another suffrage amendment introduced in Congress. Now it is 1878. This time they call it the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And this time it actually gets assigned to committee. That's a little progress, but it died in committee. There was no vote, nothing else happened. Then in 1886, the Select Committee on Women's Suffrage in the Senate did actually then get around to making a recommendation about this amendment. And they actually recommended to the Senate that this was a good idea and that they should take a vote on it. So we had the first vote in Congress for women's suffrage in 1887, and it was soundly defeated. Then we entered this period that's called the doldrums, where the national movement is really kind of quiet for a while, from about 1896 to 1910. There's still stuff happening in states, as this time the nation is expanding, new states are being added to the Union, and a lot of times they are granting women more rights than they had on the federal level. Quite often, you'll see little bits within different territories and states. One popular thing was they would give them limited suffrage. Women were allowed to vote for school board officials, school board elections. That was the first type of vote that women were allowed anywhere in the US. But on the national level, it was kind of quiet for a while. But when it came back with a different flavor and new leadership. By this time, the early leaders, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, those women had all died. So under new leadership now, and around 1908 is when we start seeing then a new shape of the movement, and it's much more public. This is when they start having the parades. The first parade was in New York City in 1908. It was led by a librarian, Maud Malone. Before then, it was considered undecorous for women to appear in public, very much like what we saw in the play with them saying, "How dare you make a spectacle of yourself out here in public doing this?" And that's kind of the way it was viewed before then. But this time is where things are starting to change. And it was like, well, why can't we be in public and have our voices heard? And so you're starting to see a little bit difference in their tactics. So they started having more of these open air meetings, and they realized that this change in mindset is going to require to have women won over, and the public, men too, right? Because they're the ones voting. They're the ones deciding if women get to vote, right? So that's where their tactics really start to change. But this is when they also start getting their opposition, just like we saw in the play. There were some women who were greatly against it. In 1911, Josephine Dodge founded the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. So now we've got opposing sides battling out. But the suffragists really have some momentum going now. They have their first big parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913. They do it the day before Woodrow Wilson is inaugurated. He's a little slow going on coming around to the suffrage movement himself. His wife was a quiet supporter, his first wife. His second wife was in the anti-movement. His daughters were for it. He had 3 daughters, but it still took him a while to come around to it. By 1914, the Senate is going to vote on the amendment again. This time it makes a slight majority win, 35 to 34, but for a constitutional amendment, you have to have a 2/3 majority to pass. So still no go. So now the suffragists get a little more in your face, basically, about getting what they want. They start picketing the White House, and day after day for months, they are picketing the White House. This is when you start to see mass arrests, the hunger strikes. They were called the silent sentinels in the prisons. They were actually force-fed and some of them beaten, but they're not backing down now. Then 1918, the House of Representatives actually passed the amendment, but it failed 2 shorts vote in the Senate. So they tried again in 1919. This time it fell short by 1 vote in the Senate. So they tried again later in the year in 1919, and finally, it passes both houses. But it's still not an amendment, because to be an official constitutional amendment, you must also be ratified by 2/3 of the states. But at least now it can go out to the states for voting. It took a whole nother year, but by 1920, Tennessee became the 36th and the final state that was needed to ratify the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. So that, yes, that was 72 years from the first call for women's suffrage as an organized thing until it was passed. 72 years. That's a pretty long struggle in our short nation's history. Now, I want to take a quick little look at our playwright, who is Mary Winsor. She was a suffragette. She was born in 1869 in Haverford, Pennsylvania. She was in a Quaker family, highly educated. She went to Drexel Institute. She went to Bryn Mawr College. So a woman of that era to have that kind of education, you kind of know that she's a little set apart, but she had big ideas. She founded in 1909 the Pennsylvania Limited Equal Suffrage League. And it was through this organization that she sought to win over public opinion. And the way this organization did that was by producing pageants and plays. And so she wrote suffrage plays to be put on publicly for free to try and win over the public to support women's suffrage. So that's where our play comes from, was this league trying to convince people that this was a worthwhile cause. She then went to England in 1913-14. She was going to survey the English suffrage movement. She was sent there by the American Academy of Political and Social Sciences. And so she finds that in England, they're fighting for the same thing, women's suffrage, but it is a very different type of battle in England. It is very militant. They are very aggressive. There was a lot of conflict between them and the government, with the police. There was a lot of open brutality. It was dangerous work to be a suffragette in England. But she came home believing that maybe that was the way to go, that they had tried playing nice for a long time. Which that makes sense, because then 1917 was when they started picketing in DC, and things did get ratcheted up. She was part of that group at the White House in 1917. And she was arrested, and she was sentenced to 60 days in the Algonquin workhouse. She was arrested again the following year, 1918, for holding a public meeting in Lafayette Square. Lafayette Square is in DC, adjacent to the White House. That was in the news recently. That was the one where they cleared protesters out so that Trump could go have his photo op at the church. So that's, if you can get that mental picture, that's exactly where she was holding a meeting. They were very close to the White House. And she was arrested for that and was sentenced to 10 days in jail in DC, and then released after she was part of the hunger strike. Then in 1919, she participated in a 23-day train tour. They organized this tour across the nation of women that had been arrested for their work in the suffrage movement, so that they could speak openly and candidly to other women about this cause and what they were fighting for. And it had great success in building much more support for the movement. And then we know then 1920, magic happens, and finally the amendment was passed. Now, thinking about our specific play that you just saw, it's set in a rummage sale. Well, that is historically accurate. The suffrage movement regularly held rummage sales and published cookbooks. Those were two of their main methods of fundraising. They were doing these things to get the funds that they needed to keep the movement going, right? So they had two main goals by producing these suffrage plays. They were trying to gain more support, wider support, especially working women, trying to join in that idea of equality in the workplace that could happen through suffrage. And they were also appealing to the upper class women, because those were the people who had the time to volunteer and organize and who had funds to contribute. So those were their two prongs that they were trying to reach out to by doing these plays. And plays were considered a great way to do it because it was entertainment, and they were usually short little plays like ours here, so that people just walking by a rally would be able to stop and watch for a little bit, but get a good message with it. And they were very resourceful and very successful with this type of campaign. I want to take a quick look at our specific play just to make sure everybody knows some of these references. There are a lot of references in this play. The Mad Hatter, I'm sure everyone knows, is a character from Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventure in Wonderland and Through a Looking Glass. Werther's Charlotte is mentioned. That one's a bit more obscure. That is a French opera by Jules Manisset that premiered in Vienna in 1892. So that's where that reference comes from. My two favorite references, also a little obscure, and you're wondering why these are included. Thomas Carlyle is included, and he was a Scottish historian and a writer, philosopher, multiple things, but he was included because, remember we talked about the English suffrage movement being a little more militant. One of the things that they did was they went into the galleries and the museums and kind of tore things up. And his portrait in London's National Portrait Gallery was actually slashed by a cleaver-wielding Anne Hunt, who was a British suffragette in 1917. So that is the reference to Thomas Carlyle. My other favorite one is this reference to Alexander Pope, who was a British poet from a couple of centuries earlier. And it's like, why are we talking about Alexander Pope? Susan B. Anthony, when she led the meetings of the National Women's Suffrage Association, she had a gavel. And on the ivory part of the gavel, there's an inscription of a quote, "Order is heaven's first law." And this comes from an Alexander Pope poem, an essay on man from 1734. So the suffragettes were highly educated, at least the ones that were the organizers and the money behind the movement. And they would have known these things. They would have studied English poetry. So that was a really fun one. And then we have a lot of historical warrior figures. Molly Pitcher was the American Revolutionary woman that took up arms. Most likely that was not a specific one person, but refers to multiple women that helped out when men went down in battle and would take up their cannon or the gun to keep the battle going. The Maid of Saragossa did the exact same thing, but in the Spanish fight for independence during the Napoleonic invasion. I think most of you know Joan of Arc, same sort of thing, young and fighting for her cause. Boudicca was the leader of the British Celtic tribe that fought the Romans that had invaded, was really known for being a fierce warrior. And of course, Clara Barton and Florence Nightingale were the women nurses out on the battlefield that feared nothing in getting the aid to the men. They were pretty amazing. And one last really interesting reference in the play is this prunes and prisms. Well, prunes and prisms is an intentional, formal, prudish speech or action. And it's a phrase that comes from a Charles Dickens novel called Little Dorrit. And it's an example of using proper speech. And so it says, when you talk to your grandmother, stick to prunes and prisms so that you don't offend her. And that being proper was something that was very important and part of why women didn't make a spectacle of themselves in public. Being proper was a big deal back then. So that's just a little tidbit about the suffrage movement and our playwright and our play. Did want to make one note. We should all be very aware that when this amendment passed, it did not give suffrage rights to all women in the US. This gave white women the right to vote. You will not get, in fact, at this time, Native women, indigenous women, weren't even considered citizens yet. They didn't even gain US citizenship until 1924. And then, of course, people of color were not able to vote until the Civil Rights era and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. So there were lots of ways of ins arounds of keeping people they didn't want to vote from being able to vote. So while it was a great accomplishment, it had shrunken its focus as it made its way forward in those 72 years. So we're very thankful for the people that fought for those rights to vote and for the ones who picked up where they left off and continued moving forward, because that's the way things always are in America, a continuous movement, not always completely forward. There is a bit of a back and forth pendulum effect, and we hope that everyone will remember how many people have fought for the rights to vote, and that you will all honor that right and privilege and cast your vote this election season. Thank you.
Yay! Absolutely. That's awesome. It's so interesting to me how things happen in America, and rarely do we seem to get it right on the first go round. You know what I mean? Like even the Constitution, like how many amendments are we at? We're at like 25 right now, right?
I think it's 25.
These little things happen, and then like the civil rights movement that happened back in the 1960s, and here we are, it's 2020, and we're still fighting for racial equality in so many different ways. So it's interesting to me that we Americans are like idealists in that, like, we want this thing, but we can't seem to get it right the first time. It's always got to come and then later.
It's 27 amendments.
27 amendments. It's more than 20.
Yeah.
Oh,
And of course, there's still one out there that has been waiting for the 2/3 state ratification for decades now, right?
the ERA.
The ERA amendment has been.
And Virginia ratified it. That was the last state that needed to ratify, but it's
Now it's
past
being
the-
contested that it was too much time,
late.
and it's all hung up again. So who knows?
So to sort of turn it back to the play, when we found this, I had no idea that plays were used in this way. Like, no idea. Because if you look at rallies today, like, it's pretty much just the candidate pontificating. You know what I mean? Like, I can't think of a modern equivalent to like a rally where something like this would be done.
No, I
There's
was
parody like SNL, right? But that's not in advance of a specific idea or candidate, right? I mean, now Biden has all of these all-star fundraisers. West Wing just did one, right? Hamilton did one. I think Marvel is doing, and I think the Avengers are doing one like right this minute.
Right.
But they're boring. It's just Zoom meetings with famous people.
Yeah, there's a lot of social activism now, I think, that's happened in like the last 50 years that's done through music rather than plays. There's a lot of protest songs, right? You know, that's a big way that people voice their discontent with something in the government or something they want to change, and people can rally around and join in and share. So I think music is probably more a modern equivalent.
Social media, like people making TikToks, people making Instagram posts.
Hashtag me too. Hashtag, right? There's,
that's a much bigger place, I think, for things like there are TikToks that are, I mean, obviously much shorter than this, but are very like this in terms of the parody style, actually, which is interesting. So yeah.
I think it's interesting that the right to vote has become so still, I mean, like, it's 2020. Our country's been around for hundreds of years. Women have had the right to vote now for 100 years. And still today, I was listening to a podcast where this woman was saying that her husband, who's 54, has never voted before.
That kind of thing amazes me. I'm by far and away, I'm the oldest person right now in this group, and I can tell you that my dad fought in World War II in South Pacific, and I knew men when I was a child growing up who had fought in the World War II, and it was not expressed in any overt way, but everybody knew. There was sort of an understanding across a great deal of the country, not everywhere, but a lot. There was an understanding that the fight was about literally the right to vote, to have a free vote. You were fighting fascists, you know, and so the idea was that you were really fighting for freedom, and freedom was really truly exemplified by the vote. And when you think about the number of people who, just to consider presidential elections, or just those, every 4 years, who do not vote, it's stunning. It's as if people just don't understand the sacrifice that has been made to be able to do that, let alone the racial sacrifices that have been made for people to do that. But the entire country made sacrifices to do that, tremendous ones. And what do? You have the opportunity to vote, and what do? You just, well, I don't care. You know, in politics, oh, it doesn't make any difference. I can't get my head around that. I've never been able to get my head around that. I never will. I'm somewhat encouraged now that it seems as though there may be more of an interest in folks of your generation, generation, to try and get more of an appreciation for and an involvement in civic life, because it's so important. You know, if you don't, you end up with the kind of thing that we're looking at now. And that's just because you write it off as if it doesn't make any difference. But it does. And you don't have to necessarily vote for my person, but you have to be involved. Right. You have to care about what's going on some level. You really do. Otherwise, the democracy just disintegrates. It does.
Yes, yeah. Being aware is step one, and I think people are starting to pay a lot more attention across the board about what's happening, and realizing where there's still vulnerabilities in our nation with the right to vote. What's happening with gerrymandering of districts? What's happening with the voter ID laws? What's happening with limiting the number of poll places? Reducing the number of places that people can get ID so that they have to travel further to get an ID, or all those different ways that seem to be about nothing other than voter suppression. It's one of those things. You cannot rest as a democracy. It is something that you have to continually be aware of those rights and how fleeting and precious they can be if you don't pay attention. That was one thing that the founders talked about, was that it takes an aware, active, educated population for a democracy to work.
Do it any other way. Absolutely required. Absolutely required. Mm-hmm. When I was out of college, in the latter part of the 20th century, we went through a time when there really was kind of it was like how shall I say, like a guardrail, not a law, but a norm that you wouldn't get in the way of somebody voting. I mean, the notion that you would attempt to pass some sort of a law that would somehow suppress votes was anathema. I mean, it's just, I can't think of one extreme side of one political party or the other who would have done that. It wouldn't have happened. But over time, if you let your guard down, if you allow those who would put those barriers in the way to act, they will act. And now we find ourselves where we are. I can tell you that in almost 70 years, I cannot believe what I'm seeing now. I never thought I would live to see a day when there would be an active attempt, a naked, bald-faced attempt to suppress people's right to vote. Never thought I would live to see that. And I can't believe I'm seeing it now. And it's just living proof that you cannot let your guard down. You must remain vigilant and involved. And I don't mean right or left. I mean for the life of the democracy itself.
It's for the greater good. It's not, I mean, everyone has their ideals and, their personal views, of course, but you're voting so we don't lose the right to vote.
There wasn't an extreme right-wing conservative within 1,000 miles in the late 20th century who would have thought for 1 second, oh yeah, let's see what we can do to close down voting stations early so that fewer people can get their ballots. I mean, people would have thought you were nuts.
Yeah.
And here's where we are.
I mean, I remember even in the first time I voted, and I remember my dad, literally got off work at 6:00 and took me to the polling place. And this was the thing. He's like, okay, you're 18 now. you're voting. Like, that was it. You know what I mean? Like, there was no question, there was no anything. Like, and the polling place was open until like 9 o'clock at night. I mean,
Yeah.
it was at the school, and it was open till 9 o'clock at night. And now there's places where polling ends at 6 p.m. and all this ridiculous. Like, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy.
Yeah, no one should have to choose between working to feed their family and voting.
Right.
There is a movement now to make Election Day a federal holiday.
Of course. That's a
Yes.
thought. That's a thought. Sure.
It wouldn't help everyone, but it would be a great start.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Definitely, yeah.
Connecticut needs to get on early voting like New York.
Or vote by mail, like in the state of Washington,
Yeah.
where you have 3 weeks
Yeah.
to fill out your ballot and send
Did
it
you
in.
know that? So Washington State is all mail-in. You don't go in at all.
Yep.
Everybody, and don't they also have a motor voter, or everybody's automatically registered? And the year that they implemented that, they had an 80% participation rate.
Yep.
80%.
There
So
you
if you make it easy, it always boggles my mind why it's so easy to vote for American Idol and so hard to vote for the American president. Why can't we make it easier for everyone to vote?
Right. So I'm in Washington, and I just dropped off my ballot today, and I stood out. I waited in line for like 15 minutes as the cars pulled up to the ballot box, because I went directly to the elections office to drop it off. And you just pull up, you drop it off in the box, and that's that. You're done. You don't get a I voted sticker. That's my complaint. I want a
You
sticker.
can print one online. It gives you a link to print it online if you want one.
There we go. I'm going to print myself an I
And
voted
the best
sticker.
thing too is that also you have a tracker number that you tear off the
Yeah.
top of your ballot, and you can go online and you can track it. You can
Look
see
at-
that it
Look at
arrived,
this.
that it was
in
scanned,
New
and
York-
it was counted.
In New York City, they gave me a key tag.
Oh,
So I have a key tag. So I'm going to go vote early. I'm going to scan my barcode. And I mean, it's not ID. I didn't have to show my driver's license. I didn't have to give them, any of that. They just sent it to me because I'm a registered voter. And I'm going to go, next week during the day.
right.
Right.
I
There
think
you
there's something sort of exciting and, about actually going. And, it's so computerized and different now. I actually used to make a joke and say, I'm going to work the polls today. As like a college kid, not knowing what I was doing with my life. But, back in the day when you used to go in with your mom or whatever and like have to like click all the buttons. I mean, I kind of wish that we would have kept things a little. I know we're saying like we want to make it easy for everyone to do, but I think there's something cool about actually having to go and like doing the ritual. And I think what this play does is what Jeff is saying. We don't see a lot of these kinds of rituals and traditions anymore, and things are kind of fading into so much, social media. So it is nice to have some of these things still available to do.
Would be
Right.
nice.
Also, how cool is it that this was literally written 107 years ago,
That's crazy.
and we're still like, as we talked about in rehearsal, and as we talked about in our first meeting with Kelly, there's so many parallels between like things that we're still fighting for today and things that are talked about in this show. I mean, it's so, that's one of the reasons why I love theater. Theater nerd. It's because you have these things that like are still relevant hundreds of years later,
Well,
And
Jeff, all the ironies that are in this play, and Kelly just brought up tonight, like I feel like just talking about this 10-minute play, I've learned more than we didn't learn ever. Okay, you learn separate events, but you don't say how long did it actually take for
That's
all of
right.
this to happen.
That's
And
right.
that there's an anti-movement amongst women. Like, I guess I should have thought there's always somebody else, but I'm like, what woman doesn't want I don't know. I thought the play was like strictly irony. I didn't know that there was actually a movement. I guess everything's based in reality. I mean, that's like super
That's
weird.
what happens when you condense history down to one little paragraph in a textbook.
Yeah.
It doesn't give you all the nuances, and
Absolutely.
sometimes summaries just don't do the job adequately.
And that review is a wonderful arc, Kelly, just a terrific arc describing, how something like that can happen. and why it takes so long. And the fact that you have to, I think it was MLK who said, right, the arc of justice is long, but eventually the arc of history is long, but eventually it bends toward justice. Well, that's
Exactly.
what this was. That's what this was.
100%.
To me, it was a real eye-opener of how many times it was introduced in Congress before it actually got a vote, and then how many times they had to keep doing it and voting before it actually passed. It's like, holy moly.
Yeah.
And I think today we get discouraged if something doesn't happen right away, really quick. And I think it speaks to the fortitude of these women that didn't give up.
And some of whom died before it even came to fruition.
There was only one woman that signed the first Seneca Falls call for suffrage that was still alive in 1920 when it passed. One.
Could you imagine fighting for something your whole life and then
72 years? I mean, she was pretty darn old and pretty lucky to have lived that, because if it took 72 years and she was old enough to be at Seneca Falls and sign it. Yeah.
That's crazy. That's absolutely crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, as everyone said in their introduction, please go vote if you're watching this. Please, please, please. Thank you all very, very much for. Yes, see, there it is, right there, in plain lettering for you all. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you to our amazing cast for joining us on this little 10-minute adventure. And we're looking forward to seeing what happens in this 2020 election and in all future elections, because we have the freedom to vote and we have the freedom to choice, and hopefully we don't lose that in any way.
Don't just vote in the general, vote in your local elections. They matter. They're why we have gerrymandering.
And
They're why we have local problems. Vote every chance that you are given.
Every opportunity.
Vote, people.
Yes, indeed.
Vote.
Yep.